everyone, welcome. Hope everyone is doing well. I'm Jenny Panzurk, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the prongs when we were talking about eligibility for special education. We know that there are 3 prongs for special education eligibility. There is has a disability, there is that adversely affects the student's educational performance, and then there's that third one, requires special education, right? So we have a disability that has an adverse effect on students' educational performance that requires special education and related services. Now, requires is an interesting term. One of the other terms that we see in some of our federal and state regulation language is also needs special education, right? Sometimes when I'm having discussions with teams, sometimes the question people want to ask is, would the student benefit from special education? And that's not our obligation to answer that question, right? I have worked with many amazing special education teachers, and I think a lot of students would benefit from that. But when we are talking about eligibility for special education, the question is whether or not the student requires or needs special education. So I wanted to just kind of talk about this. Those that maybe haven't come to one of my lives before, maybe don't get my newsletter or something like that, you might not know much about my background. I've been part of the wonderful field of school psychology for over 20 years. I live in Southern California and have practiced here for many years. I've been a school psychologist, I've been an administrator, I'm a licensed educational psychologist. Nowadays, I do a lot of training in school districts in and around California. I also get to help support school psychologists through some online memberships. I'm the founder of the Prepared School Site community. And when I think about how our field has kind of changed over the last 2.5 decades now that I've been a part of this, that third prong requires special education. I think for me, when I think about that last piece there, how are we documenting that evidence? In some ways, it's very similar. In some ways, it's a little bit different. And this is what I mean by a little bit different. I felt like very early in my career, when we talked about whether or not we were going to move forward with the assessment process, typically the schools that I had worked at, we had some really nice intervention programs that were going on. We had tried a lot of different things and documented those attempts at intervention programs, accommodations, strategy ideas within the general education setting. I was always really a part of those processes and those documentations, those ongoing meetings to really talk about who's benefiting from these, who's struggling and maybe is in the wrong intervention program. Maybe we need to change something. So I felt like a lot of times, because I was so embedded in a lot of those kind of pre-referral processes, and the fact that we had a lot of pre-referral processes at many of the schools that I worked at, that by the time we had moved into, I think assessment is an appropriate next step, we tended to be moving into that step because not that we had already made a decision, but we were there because we were like, we have all this documentation of all these other things that we have been trying that have just not been successful for this student. And so it felt like a very appropriate next step. So kind of 2 things were going on there that for myself, while I'm not employed by any particular school district, I do get to help out in a lot of school districts. I do get to wear my school psychology hat as well as my private practice hat as well. And, 2 kind of things stick out for me when I'm comparing that time versus this time. One of those is how much I'm involved in some of these cases. So I know nowadays, not every school psychologist is part of every single, whether you call it a student study team meeting or a MTSS meeting, whatever, however you talk about or kind of talk about those meetings before we decide to go forward with an evaluation. I'm not typically a part of it just because of my role in schools right now. A lot of times I'm coming in and I'm just kind of helping with overflow assessments. So I don't get to participate in that that same way. I personally don't have a lot of that background information, but I know talking with so many different school psychologists, a lot of people either aren't invited or don't have time to attend all of the meetings because there's only so many hours in the day to attend all of these meetings, right? And so there's not always that same documentation, that knowledge of the evidence of like all of these different things that we have tried. One of the other things that happens sometimes is we're well aware that many different people in our world have the right to suspect that a child has a disability. And a lot of times we're moving kind of directly to the point of assessment, and we might not have had all of that documented strategy ideas and all those different things to kind of rely on. So a lot of times we're kind of in a different spot than some of us used to be. So I just want you to kind of reflect on kind of where you are at. And one of the things that I have found to be really useful nowadays, because I don't have the same exact experiences that I had early on in my career, is a lot of times when we are talking about evaluating a student for special education consideration, of course, we have a lot of data about that particular student, right? We might have some standardized test information. We've got the progress and universal screeners, any intervention programs. We've got all this input, all the records we've looked at, all the people we've talked to, right? We've observed the student. We've got a lot of focused evaluation on this individual student. And the question is, do we have some context for some of this data as well? And by context, I'm just referring to, do we know how everyone else is doing, right? So do I have information not just about how this student is doing on universal screening data, but do I know how the students in the grade level in general are doing? Right? Sometimes that contextual information can be really, really helpful. And again, when I think back about kind of some of the roles that I played in some of my previous schools that I had been at and been assigned to, many times I was well aware of the other data because I was part of those conversations when we talked about data, not just about individual students, but across grade levels, right? In some schools, I was the holder of the intervention data, right? I was the one who was putting together the data for our data meetings. I love making an Excel graph, right? And so I had a lot of that contextual information. So not only was I going in and being able to talk about how my individual student that I was really focusing on, but I had the information about, well, and in comparison to the other students in the intervention program, right? So because we had worked so hard to really build up some really great interventions and we were really trying to match interventions for student needs, a lot of times having that other information of, wow, a lot of other students are making this kind of progress, and my student's making this kind of progress. That kind of contextual information for me was very helpful. And I know nowadays not everyone gets to be involved in all those meetings. Again, there's only so many meetings we can attend, right? So one of the questions is, how can I get access to and understand some of this other data that may be available that could be really helpful when we're trying to make this really important decision as a team about whether or not the student requires special education. Now, this is one of the topics that, like I mentioned, has kind of shifted for me over the years. And I've really been thinking about what are some great practical ways, like looking at contextual information, that we can really make sure we're documenting, gathering, examining, analyzing as part of this process here so that we can make these good decisions. And in January, I know we just started December and I'm already talking about January, I'm going to be doing a training on this topic, all about require special education. I know many of you, we have hundreds of people who are already part of our whole training series. We did a training in November. We're doing one next week in December. And then this one about requiring special education is in January. We have 2 more that are going to be in this series, and I just want to share with you, if you haven't checked out all the information, just go to my website, jennyponzurek.com, and you can check out all the information about the live training series that we are doing. If you missed any of the ones that we've already done, guess what? We record everything. You can listen to the replay. If you don't want to attend everything because only certain topics really, tug at what I was going to say your heartstrings, but, most of us are very passionate about the work that we are doing and helping and supporting the students that we are doing. So whatever topic, you can also just decide, I only want to go to this one about requires special ed. Maybe you feel really confident about some of the other areas that I'm talking about. Awesome. That is great. If you want to come to this one, you can just sign up for this one. All right, we've got all the information over on my website. Feel free to take a look at that. And as always, if you have any questions about any of that information, there's a bunch of places on my website, jennypunzerek.com, where you can just go ahead and reach out and ask us questions anytime. All right, thank you all for hanging out, and I will see you all soon. Bye.